Emily Carter did not expect the night to stretch the way it did, cold and quiet outside the tall glass building in downtown Chicago, where most of the lights had already gone dark and the wind moved fast between the empty streets, lifting the edge of her coat as she stood near the curb checking her phone for the third time, battery almost gone, no rides available nearby, and one short message from her husband Daniel sitting at the top of the screen, running late again. I'm sorry, she stared at the words longer than she meant to, not because they were cruel, but because they were familiar, and familiarity sometimes hurt more than anger, especially when it came wrapped in distance and long work hours and dinners eaten alone at the small kitchen table of their townhouse. She slipped her phone into her purse and tried to tell herself it was fine, that marriages went through seasons, that Daniel was building something for their future, yet the future felt far away on a night like this when all she wanted was someone to show up on time and look at her like she still mattered. The parking lot was nearly empty now, only a few cars scattered under pale streetlights, and she considered walking to the train station 2 blocks away when a sleek black sedan slowed beside her, tires soft against the pavement, window lowering with a quiet hum. She turned, surprised, and met the steady eyes of Mark Sullivan, Daniel's boss, a man known in the office for sharp suits, calm leadership, and a presence that made people stand straighter without knowing why. Emily? You're still here? He asked, voice warm but controlled, and she felt a small rush of embarrassment at being seen stranded, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. She explained that Daniel had been held up at work again and she was waiting for a ride, brushing it off as if it didn't bother her, and Mark nodded slowly, glancing at the empty street before saying, I'm heading toward Lincoln Park. Let me give you a ride. No point waiting out here in this cold. She hesitated for a second, not because she doubted him, but because accepting help felt like admitting she had been left behind, yet the wind cut through her thin gloves and practicality won, so she thanked him and slid into the passenger seat, the car warm, clean, quiet, a soft instrumental song playing low in the background. As he pulled away from the curb, she noticed how different it felt to sit beside someone who wasn't rushing, who wasn't checking emails at red lights, who simply focused on the road ahead. They drove in comfortable silence at first, city lights passing over the windshield in golden streaks, and Emily watched her reflection faintly in the glass, wondering when she had started looking so tired. Mark broke the quiet with an easy question about her day, and she answered honestly, telling him about the client presentation she had led that afternoon, expecting the topic to fade quickly, but instead he nodded with interest and said, You handled that room well. You were clear. Confident. People listened. She blinked, surprised by the detail in his comment, because it meant he had been paying attention, and something inside her shifted at the simple recognition. She thanked him, her voice softer now, and he added, You don't give yourself enough credit, as if stating a fact rather than offering flattery. The traffic light turned red and the car slowed, giving them a still moment under the glow of the signal, and Emily felt the weight of his words more than she expected, because lately at home conversations were about deadlines, promotions, budgets, and future plans, rarely about who she was or how she felt. Mark glanced at her briefly, not staring, just noticing, and said in a tone that carried no hidden meaning, Daniel is lucky to have you, and that simple sentence pressed against a quiet ache she hadn't spoken aloud. She looked down at her hands in her lap, twisting the edge of her scarf, unsure how to respond, because admitting she didn't feel valued would sound like betrayal, yet pretending everything was perfect felt dishonest, so she chose a careful middle ground and said, We're both just busy, and he nodded as if he understood more than she had said. The car moved again, smooth and steady, and he spoke about balance, about how easy it was to let ambition take over, about how important it was to protect what mattered before success replaced connection, and though he never criticized Daniel directly, his words carried a quiet truth that landed close to home. Emily found herself talking more than she planned, sharing small pieces of her life, how she and Daniel used to cook together on Sundays, how they once stayed up late planning road trips, They never took. How lately those simple things had been replaced by silence and separate schedules, and Mark listened without interrupting, offering thoughtful responses rather than quick advice. When they reached her neighborhood, the streets calmer and lined with bare trees, she felt an unexpected reluctance for the ride to end, not because it was romantic or inappropriate, but because for 20 minutes she had felt heard, fully, without needing to compete with a screen or a deadline. He pulled up in front of her townhouse and shifted the car into park, engine humming softly, and for a brief second neither of them moved to break the moment. "Emily," he said gently, turning slightly toward her, "I hope you know your worth isn't measured by how busy someone is," and the words settled between them like something fragile and important. She felt her throat tighten, not from sadness alone but from the shock of being understood so clearly, and she managed a quiet thank you before opening the door. The night air felt colder than before, yet her chest felt strangely warm as she stepped onto the sidewalk, and she closed the car door carefully, watching as he gave a small nod and drove away, taillights fading into the distance. She stood there for a moment under the porch light, keys in hand, replaying his sentence in her mind, because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a confession, it wasn't even personal in an obvious way. Yet it touched something deep inside her that had been waiting to be acknowledged. When she finally entered the quiet house, placing her purse on the counter and glancing at the empty dining table, she realized the ride home had been short in miles but long in meaning, and as she moved through the familiar rooms, she couldn't ignore the simple truth forming in her heart. Sometimes it takes an unexpected voice to remind you of your value. And sometimes that reminder changes the way you see everything waiting on the other side of the door. The next morning Emily woke before her alarm, Mark's words still clear in her mind, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like a truth she had been avoiding, and a soft light slipped through the curtains of their Chicago townhouse. She lay still for a moment listening to the quiet house, wondering when silence had started to feel heavier than noise. Daniel was already in the shower, the sound of running water echoing down the hall, and she moved slowly to the kitchen, starting coffee, trying to focus on small tasks instead of the strange warmth that had followed her home the night before. Daniel came out dressed for work, tie slightly crooked, eyes on his phone as he scanned emails, and he kissed her forehead quickly, distracted, saying he might be late again because a new client needed attention, and she nodded, not angry, just tired of nodding, tired of understanding everything without being understood in return. She almost told him about the ride, about how his boss had offered kindness when she needed it. But something stopped her, not guilt exactly, more like confusion. Because she didn't know what the story meant yet, and she didn't want to turn something simple into something complicated. At the office the air felt different, charged with something she couldn't name, and she kept her head down, focusing on her computer, answering emails, reminding herself that professionalism mattered, that boundaries mattered. Yet when she entered the morning meeting and took her seat across the table she felt Mark's presence before she looked up, calm and composed as always, discussing campaign numbers with sharp clarity. When it was her turn to speak she felt a flicker of nervous energy but pushed through it, explaining her strategy with clear steps and steady tone. And when she finished she noticed him nod once, firm and approving, not exaggerated, just certain, and that small gesture lifted something inside her she hadn't realized was sinking. After the meeting ended people gathered their laptops and filtered out, but Mark lingered, organizing papers slowly before glancing toward her and saying, "Emily, can you walk with me a minute?" And her pulse quickened, though his tone remained professional. They stepped into the hallway, sunlight spilling through tall windows, and he spoke about the upcoming campaign, how he wanted fresh leadership, how he believed she had the instincts and clarity to handle more responsibility, and she stopped mid-step, surprised, because Daniel had once promised similar opportunities but lately their conversations had been about survival at work, not growth, and hearing someone else say they believed in her felt both empowering and unsettling. She thanked him carefully, keeping her voice measured, but he looked at her with thoughtful eyes and added, "You underestimate yourself," and she almost laughed at the timing of that sentence, because it echoed what he had said in the car, and she realized he wasn't flirting, wasn't crossing lines, he was simply observing her honestly, which somehow felt even more intimate. She told him she had been doubting herself lately, that it was hard to balance everything, and he listened without interrupting, hands loosely in his pockets, and when she mentioned feeling invisible at home she regretted it instantly, but instead of reacting with surprise he said quietly, "It's easy to lose connection when work becomes the center of everything," and she felt seen again, deeply, without judgment. The day moved fast after that, tasks stacking up, calls coming in, yet her thoughts kept circling back to the hallway conversation, to the way someone had looked at her not as Daniel's wife, not as an assistant on a project, but as a capable woman with value. In the afternoon she found a moment alone in the break room, staring into her coffee cup, asking herself what exactly she was feeling, because it wasn't betrayal. It wasn't a crush like something out of a teenage movie, it was something quieter and more adult, a recognition of emotional hunger she hadn't admitted before. Later, as employees packed up for the evening, Mark approached her desk again, this time with a simple question about her ideas for the campaign, and their conversation flowed easily, professional but layered with unspoken understanding, and when he asked what she would change about the company if she could, she answered honestly, saying she wished leaders would slow down long enough to notice their teams as people, not just numbers, and he smiled faintly as if appreciating the directness. As they walked toward the elevator together, the building was quieter, footsteps echoing in the hallway, and there was a moment when the conversation paused, hanging in the air, neither of them quite ready to step away. He looked at her then, not intense, not inappropriate, just steady, and asked softly, "Do you ever feel like you're someone's last priority instead of their first?" And the question hit her harder than she expected, because it put words to something she had been carrying silently. 4 months. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, but she didn't move immediately, her heart beating faster, and she answered with a simple, "Sometimes," because anything more would have revealed too much, and he nodded slowly, as if that one word confirmed everything he suspected. They stepped inside, standing at a respectful distance, the mirrored walls reflecting two adults aware of a connection forming in the space between honesty and restraint. When the doors opened on the lobby level, she felt the shift clearly now, the sense that this was no longer just about a ride home or workplace encouragement, it was about choice, about emotional lines that could blur if she wasn't careful. And as they walked toward the exit, he said one more thing in a low voice, "Everyone deserves to feel chosen," and she carried that sentence with her into the evening air. Driving home alone this time, she thought about Daniel, about the early years of their marriage when they used to sit close on the couch and talk about everything, when being chosen felt natural and easy, and she realized the ache in her chest wasn't for another man but for the version of her life where she felt valued without having to earn it daily. By the time she reached home she understood something important. The connection growing at work wasn't built on reckless desire but on unmet needs, and that realization scared her more than anything else, because unmet needs could quietly change a heart if ignored too long. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside the dim house, she knew she was standing at the edge of something delicate, something that could either wake her marriage up or pull her further away from it, and for the first time she felt the weight of a decision forming, not dramatic, not immediate, but steady and real, like a crossroads waiting just ahead. That evening the house felt smaller than usual, as if the walls had quietly moved closer, and Emily stood in the kitchen staring at the clock while Daniel sat at the dining table with his laptop open, blue light reflecting on his tired face, and she knew she could not carry the silence any longer because something inside her had shifted and pretending otherwise would only make it worse. She walked toward him with steady steps, heart beating fast but clear in purpose, and said softly, "We need to talk," and the seriousness in her voice made him look up immediately, fingers pausing above the keyboard. He leaned back in his chair, concern replacing distraction, and asked what was wrong, and for a second she almost chose the easy path, almost said it was nothing, almost smiled and walked away. But instead she took a breath and told the truth in the simplest way she could. She missed him, not just his presence in the house but his attention, his warmth. The way he used to look at her like she was part of his future and not just someone waiting at the end of his long workdays. Daniel listened without interrupting, confusion first, then guilt slowly crossing his expression, and he defended himself gently, saying he was working hard for them, for stability, for security, for everything they had dreamed of, but she shook her head and said she understood that, she respected that, yet she felt alone even when he was sitting 3 feet away. And that loneliness had started to feel heavier than any financial worry. The conversation did not explode into shouting, it unfolded in careful sentences, honest but controlled, two adults realizing how far distance could grow without either one meaning for it to happen, and Daniel admitted he had been overwhelmed, chasing targets and promotions, telling himself it was temporary, not noticing how temporary had turned into normal. She told him she had started doubting herself, wondering if she was asking for too much by wanting time, connection, simple moments like dinner without phones, and when she said she wanted to feel chosen again, his eyes softened in a way she had not seen in months. He closed the laptop completely then, pushing it aside, and said quietly that he never meant to make her feel second to anything, that he thought providing more would prove his love, not realizing she needed presence more than promises. Hearing that cracked something open in her chest because it reminded her of the man she married, the man who once drove 3 hours in the snow just to surprise her on her birthday, the man who used to leave notes in her purse for no reason at all. But honesty has layers, and as the silence settled between them she knew she had to admit the rest, not details that would hurt unnecessarily, but the truth about how the attention from someone else had made her realize what was missing at home. She told Daniel that being noticed at work had reminded her she still had value, that someone had spoken words she did not know she needed to hear, and though she did not say Mark's name, Daniel understood enough to stiffen slightly, fear flickering in his eyes, not anger but realization that neglect can create space where it should not exist. He asked quietly if she had crossed any lines, and she answered firmly that she had not, that she would not, because despite everything she still believed in them, still believed their marriage deserved effort before surrender, and that answer seemed to steady him. He stood up then and walked closer, not to argue but to close the physical distance that had mirrored their emotional one, and he reached for her hands, holding them carefully as if afraid she might pull away. He apologized without excuses this time, not blaming workload or pressure, just admitting he had taken her patience for granted, and she felt tears rise but kept her voice steady as she said apologies would only matter if they led to change. They talked late into the night about small practical steps, shared dinners 3 times a week, phones away after 9, a weekend trip they had postponed twice, and though none of it was dramatic or cinematic, it felt real, grounded, like rebuilding instead of escaping. The next day at work Emily carried a different energy, not lighter exactly but clearer, and she avoided lingering conversations, focusing on tasks with renewed determination, because clarity often demands boundaries. When she saw Mark near the conference room he greeted her as usual, calm and respectful, but he seemed to sense the shift in her posture, the quiet decision behind her eyes, and later that afternoon she found herself standing outside his office door, knowing she needed to speak before unspoken feelings grew into something unfair. She knocked lightly and stepped inside, and he looked up, attentive, asking if everything was all right, and she told him she appreciated his support more than she could say, that his words had reminded her of her worth at a time she needed it most, but she also said she had chosen to fight for her marriage, to repair what distance had damaged instead of seeking comfort elsewhere. Mark listened without interruption, jaw tightening slightly yet expression composed, and when she finished he nodded slowly, saying he respected her decision completely, that integrity mattered more than emotion, and there was a quiet sadness in his eyes that made her chest ache, because connection does not disappear simply because it is restrained. He admitted gently that he admired her strength, that in different circumstances he might have pursued something more, but he would never ask her to risk what she had built, and hearing that confirmed what she already knew, that the attraction had been rooted in understanding, not impulse, and that choosing her marriage was not about denying feelings but honoring commitment. When she left his office she felt both relief and loss, like closing a door that had never fully opened, and as she returned to her desk she realized something important. The edge of choice is not always loud or dramatic, sometimes it is quiet and steady, a decision made in a calm room with no witnesses, yet powerful enough to change the direction of a life. That evening Daniel came home earlier than expected, carrying takeout from her favorite Italian place, awkward but sincere, and when he set the food on the table and looked at her with intention instead of distraction she saw effort in his posture, real effort, not perfect but present, as they ate together without screens between them, talking about simple things like a movie they wanted to watch and a park they used to visit. She felt hope return slowly, not because everything was fixed but because both of them were finally awake to what they almost lost. And as she washed the dishes later, warm water running over her hands, she understood that temptation often appears not to destroy love but to reveal its weak spots, and standing at that fragile edge had forced her to choose consciously instead of drifting silently, and in that choice she found strength she did not know she had, strength rooted not in longing for someone new but in courage to repair what was already hers. The weeks that followed did not transform Emily and Daniel's marriage overnight, but something steady began to grow where distance once lived, and that quiet growth mattered more than dramatic promises ever could. Daniel started coming home earlier at least 3 nights a week, not because his workload suddenly vanished but because he chose to protect time the way he once protected deadlines, and the first evening he walked in before sunset carrying groceries instead of his laptop bag. Emily felt a small spark of hope she had almost forgotten was possible. They cooked together in their narrow kitchen, bumping into each other near the stove, laughing awkwardly at first like two people relearning a rhythm, and when Daniel reached for her hand without thinking, just to pull her closer as he tasted the sauce, the gesture felt natural, not forced, and she realized connection often returns through small repeated actions rather than grand speeches. They began taking short walks after dinner, circling the quiet streets of their Chicago neighborhood, talking about things beyond work, music they used to love, trips they still wanted to take, the idea of starting a family someday, and though some conversations were clumsy and others tender, the simple act of sharing thoughts again stitched something fragile back together. Daniel also surprised her one Saturday morning by suggesting couples therapy, admitting he did not want pride to stand in the way of growth, and sitting in that calm office across from a counselor forced them to say things clearly, without blame, about expectations, stress, fear of failure, and the way ambition had slowly replaced affection. Emily admitted she had felt invisible. Daniel admitted he had confused providing with loving, and speaking those truths out loud removed some of their power to quietly hurt. At work Emily maintained a careful professionalism with Mark, conversations limited to projects, meetings brief and focused, yet there was no coldness between them, only a respectful distance shaped by mutual understanding. She noticed he never placed her in situations that would invite gossip, never lingered unnecessarily, and that restraint deepened her respect for him even as it made the space between them feel final. One afternoon he called her into his office to discuss a departmental shift, explaining that her skills would be better utilized in a different branch of the company where she could grow without reporting directly to him, and though the decision made strategic sense, she sensed the deeper intention behind it, a quiet effort to remove complexity before it had a chance to return. She thanked him sincerely, understanding that sometimes caring for someone means stepping back rather than stepping closer. On her last day working under his leadership, the office buzzed with normal activity, unaware of the emotional chapter closing quietly behind glass doors, and as she packed a few framed photos and notebooks into a box, she felt gratitude more than regret, gratitude that a difficult season had revealed truths instead of destroying trust. Mark stopped by her desk before she left, dressed as sharply as always, expression calm yet softer than usual, and he congratulated her on the transition, praising her growth, telling her he expected great things from her in the new department, and when she thanked him for believing in her at a time she needed encouragement, their eyes held for a brief second that carried memory without promise. "You deserve to be happy," he said simply, not as a suggestion but as a hope, and she replied, "I'm working on it," with a quiet confidence she had not felt months earlier. There were no dramatic farewells, no lingering touches, just a firm handshake and a shared understanding that what passed between them had served its purpose. It had awakened awareness, not replaced commitment. That evening Daniel waited outside the building in his car, something he had started doing on Fridays as a small ritual, and when she slid into the passenger seat this time, the role felt symbolic, not of rescue but of partnership, and he smiled at her in a way that reached his eyes, asking how her final day went, truly listening as she described it. They drove toward Lake Michigan instead of home, windows slightly open to let in the cool breeze, and parked near the water where the city lights shimmered against the dark surface. Sitting quietly side by side watching waves roll in steady patterns, Daniel reached for her hand and apologized again, not out of guilt but gratitude, saying he was thankful she had chosen to fight for them instead of walking away when it would have been easier to drift, and she squeezed his fingers gently, telling him they both had chosen, and that choice mattered every day. As weeks turned into months, the consistency of their effort built trust again, not perfect but real, and Emily noticed she no longer replayed old conversations in her mind or wondered about alternate paths, because the present required her full attention. She poured her energy into her new role at work, thriving under fresh leadership, confident in her abilities without seeking validation in hidden ways. And at home she and Daniel established small traditions: Sunday brunch at a local cafe, movie nights on the couch, occasional weekend drives out of the city, that anchored them in shared experience. There were still stressful days, still moments of frustration, but now they addressed them directly instead of retreating into silence, understanding that neglect begins quietly and grows if left unchecked. Emily realized the most unexpected gift from that season was clarity about her needs, about boundaries, about the difference between attraction born of loneliness and love built on history and commitment. Sometimes she would think of Mark briefly, usually when a project from the old department crossed her desk, and instead of longing she felt appreciation, because his kindness had not stolen her heart but had reminded her to protect it. She understood now that emotional crossroads do not always end in loss, sometimes they strengthen the road already chosen. One evening nearly a year later, as she and Daniel sat on their back porch watching a soft sunset paint the sky pink and gold, he rested his head lightly against hers and said he felt closer to her than he had in a long time, and she believed him, not because everything was flawless but because they had both done the hard work of staying. In that quiet moment she recognized the simple truth that had guided her through confusion: being seen is powerful, but being committed is transformative, and while unexpected words can awaken a sleeping heart, it is daily intention that keeps love alive. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared above the Chicago skyline, Emily felt peace settle gently within her, not dramatic or loud, just steady and certain, and she knew that sometimes the most meaningful endings are not about who you almost chose, but about rediscovering why you chose the person beside you in the first place.